Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our September edition of Coffee with the Curator. My name is Charlie Knight. I'm the Curator of Military History at the North Carolina Museum of History. And as many of you folks know, I know some of you know me, I'm big into military history, obviously, but one of my side interests has always been pirates. And I think that's true for a lot of folks, whether it's having read Treasure Island as a little kid or seen Peter Pan or, of course, Pirates of the Caribbean. There's all kinds of pirate-related things that are out there, either in writing or from Hollywood that really seem to catch people's attention. And they're usually not necessarily the most historically accurate thing, but they do serve to generate interest in pirates, and hopefully for a lot of folks, that Jack Sparrow or Long John Silver, will actually spark enough of an interest that folks will be inclined to dig and actually find out a little bit more about what pirates were really like. So today I want to spend a few minutes doing, I guess you could kind of call this Pirates 101. What was life like as a pirate? Was there really buried treasure? Did they walk around with a pirate on their shoulder and an eye patch, going "arr" all the time? And the answer to just about every one of those is no. It's a Hollywood creation or a fiction writer's creation. But like a lot of things, it is based in fact. Particularly when you talk about, pirates, having a fondness for rum and going around drinking and playing cards and chasing women. That part actually is true. And I want to start off by reading a quote here from a book that's published in, I want to say, the 1820s by a guy by the name of Charles Elms, called The Pirate's Own Book. And this kind of sums up what life truly was like for a pirate. The pirate is truly fond of women and wine, and when not engaged in robbing, keeps maddened with intoxicating liquors and passes his time in debauchery, singing old songs with choruses like "Drain, drain the bowl, each fearless soul. Let the world wag as it will. Let the heavens growl, let the devil howl. Drain, drain the deep bowl and fill." And, it kind of goes back to life on a ship. There's not really much to do other than sit around and drink and play cards. And when you got into a port, you wanted to take advantage of the things that you could not take advantage of while you were out at sea. So let's just jump right in here. And like I say, I want to do this kind of as a Pirates 101 type of thing. We'll mention a few of the big names, Blackbeard, of course, and some of the others. But really, I want to give you folks at home some time to ask any questions that you might have at the end. Bear in mind, this is just a side interest for me. I'm not a pirate expert by any means, so take it lightly on me, if you will. But I guess we can start out talking about what we call the golden age of piracy, the first couple decades of the 1700s. That's when most of the guys that we most associate with piracy were around. Blackbeard, Charles Vane, Jack Rackham, Anne Bonny, Sam Bellamy, a lot of these other, the big name pirate captains, they really only functioned for a period of about 20 or 25 years at the beginning of the 18th century. And that's is kind of indicative of the fact that life as a pirate really was a short one. These guys did not live to see old age. When you're living a life of crime, and that's truly what it was, maritime crime, you're not really going to live long. There's a good chance you're either going to die in battle, your ship could founder in a storm and sink, or there's a good chance that you're going to get captured and be hanged. So these guys, they don't live to be, older fellows. They're not very well educated. The captains, some of them were, but by and large, pirate crews, they're not educated hardly at all. Most of them are illiterate. That's why we know so little about these guys. One, they couldn't read or write for the most part, and two, when you're living this life, it's not exactly something that you want to write down in a diary and share with the world. In case your ship gets captured and you're pleading innocence, then they find your diary that details everything you've done as a pirate. So there's not a lot of information out there. Most of the time, we know more about how a pirate met his end than we do about the rest of his life combined. And the little bit that we do know about most pirates comes from trial records, when and if they were captured, as well as accounts that were given in usually newspapers or sometimes insurance claims when when a merchant ship had an encounter with a pirate on the high seas. They'd get back to port and usually exaggerate quite a bit. We just had this run-in with Blackbeard. We were lucky to escape with our lives. And then, of course, when you're reporting your losses, of course, you're going to exaggerate what you lost. So there's not really a lot of primary source information out there about these guys. Most of what we do know about them really comes from one source. Apart from these newspaper accounts and trial records, it comes from this book called The General History of the Pirates, which was published in the 1720s, a few years after some of these guys met their deaths. Some of them were even still on the high seas. It was written by a guy who went by the name of Captain Charles Johnson. We don't really know who Johnson is. Some people think that he was a pirate himself, that Johnson was a made-up name, because he knew what he was writing about. He obviously knew quite a few of these pirate captains themselves, because he knew details about them that he couldn't have known otherwise. A lot of it he probably picked up secondhand in Nassau or who knows where from talking to other pirate captains and pirate crew members. But however he got this information, he had information that no one else did. And a lot of what is quote unquote known information about these guys from the golden age of piracy is traced back to Johnson's book. Some people have made the claim that Johnson is actually Daniel Defoe, who was the author of Robinson Crusoe. It's never been proven, and there's good evidence pointing both directions of that argument. But whoever he is, Johnson gives us a lot of what we know about these guys. So when you're reading subsequent biographies of these guys, particularly Blackbeard, it's almost all just simply rehashing what Charles Johnson had written back in the 1720s. And that book, it was extremely popular when it came out. It's still popular today. It's kind of a hard read today when you think about the language of, 300 years ago. It's not exactly something you can sit down and take as a light reading. But it is interesting to read. And of course, some of it has to be embellished. But when we look at the descriptions of some of these guys, particularly Blackbeard, where do we get the description of Blackbeard? Again, Charles Johnson. And talking about the description of Blackbeard, his physical appearance, pirates dealt more in fear and trying to intimidate than they did in actually going out and getting into stand-up fights. When you think about a pirate ship, these guys, they're out there, they're not really supplied by anybody. If they need food, ammunition, whatever, they have to capture it themselves or trade for it. It's not like they can go, back to a seaport in England and tell the Royal Navy that they need to replenish their ammo. No, that's not how it works. So these guys, they didn't really want to get in stand-up fights very often. One, it was difficult to replenish their ammunition. Two, if you get in a fight, there's a chance you're going to lose. You're probably going to lose some of your men in the process. And also, it's just, that's not really how they wanted to do this. A pirate ship, even though when we look at, say, Blackbeard and the Queen Anne's Revenge, it was a 40-gun thing, a very imposing vessel. Pirates, they didn't want these big warships. They wanted something smaller, sleek, fast. Having this firepower was good. It was great for intimidation. But again, you face this shortage of ammunition. A lot of these guys are not trained gunners. A lot of them are learning this on the fly. Of course, they have mentors, and this is knowledge that gets passed down from generation to generation, if you will, of pirates. As a new guy comes on board, some of the older guys are going to teach him the ropes, so to speak, in some cases, literally. But when you're approaching a ship that you want to pillage, you don't really want to fire on it because you probably want to capture the ship. You don't want to damage the ship beyond repair. You want to take intact whatever cargo is on there. So you might fire a warning shot to tell the captain of the other vessel, we're coming for you. And if you're in something big like the Queen Anne's Revenge, you're probably not going to be able to run down a smaller ship. So you want something much smaller, that maybe mounts 8, 10, 12 guns, but is built for speed. So you can run down your intended target. And I think a good modern analogy of this is take something like a Corvette and an 18-wheeler. Which one's going to go faster? The sports car. If you get into an accident, which one's going to win? The 18-wheeler. So, if you're trying to chase something down, you want that sports car. You don't necessarily want the big bulky thing that will win in a stand-up fight, but it's not going to be your best option. More often than getting into stand-up fights like that, the pirate crews, their plan, intercept. Say your target vessel's going this way. Pirate ship is going to approach normally from back here and try and head it off. If you can entice them, the civilian ship, to stop by hoisting the black flag, which normally had a skeleton and blood, and was part of the whole intimidation thing. You're going to fire a warning shot. Hopefully, the merchant captain will be smart enough to stop, and then rather than open fire with a broadside or whatever, pirate vessel is going to come up alongside, and they're going to board it. And in the rare cases where the target vessel doesn't surrender and actually does want to put up a fight, you're going to have your crew literally jump over the side onto the target vessel, and you're going to have hand-to-hand combat with pistols, axes, cutlasses, anything they can find. And it's going to be very brutal. And if the civilian captain is dumb enough not to surrender, if he actually tries to get away, or even worse, puts up a fight, well, guess what? That means when, not if, but when his ship is captured, he's going to be killed or tortured. His crew is probably going to be killed or marooned, and in a lot of cases, the ship would be burned. So when you saw a pirate coming, your best option is to just stop and let them take your ship and file for insurance losses later. A lot of cases, that's what happened. And when a ship surrendered, most of the time, the pirate captain that captured it, they wouldn't do anything. Yeah, they might shove you around and rough you up a little bit, but they're not going to come in and kill you or torture you or anything like that. There were exceptions to that. Perhaps the most famous example of pirate cruelty is a guy by the name of Ned Lowe. He operated a little bit after Blackbeard. He kind of picks up from right after Blackbeard dies and is active for the first couple of years in the 1720s. Ned Lowe, I think in modern terms, we would call him a psychopath. He would be, one of these serial killer guys. He really seemed to just enjoy torturing and killing people. There was one of the more famous examples. He caught I think it was a Portuguese ship, and they hadn't even done anything to him. If I'm remembering correctly, they had surrendered without a fight. But Lowe, just because he was basically nuts, he goes up to the captain and orders the captain's lips cut his lips cut off. Try that again. Has them boiled, and then he makes the guy eat them before he kills them. There are other times where he would burn people alive. He had a particular thing where he liked to wrap fingers, intertwine rope in the person's fingers, and set the rope on fire. So yeah, Lowe, he's kind of your far end example there. The worst of the worst. Most of these guys, while they are criminals, they're not out to hurt you. They're out to get an easy steal. They're kind of like a pickpocket on the street or whatever. They want to take whatever money they can get and get back out of Dodge to safety before their location is turned into the Royal Navy and they're hunted down. Some of these guys, Stede Bonnet, he's known as the gentleman pirate. He's kind of the other end from Ned Lowe. Bonnet is really unique in his background. There's actually probably more known about Bonnet than anybody else. He was a former British Army officer who went to Barbados down in the Caribbean, and he had a plantation down there, had a wife and family, and then one day just woke up and decided, I want to be a pirate. And historians have been struggling trying to figure out what his reasoning was for that. Some people say he was just sick of his wife. Some people say that, family life was not him. Others, and this one probably is at least partially true, that he had something was off with him mentally. And other folks, chalk it up to early midlife crisis, just needing a change. But whatever the reason, Bonnet goes out, buys a ship. That's not how pirates are supposed to get their ships. They're supposed to go out and steal a small fishing vessel and work their way up till they get something respectable. No, Bonnet goes out, buys a pirate ship, hires a crew. Here again, your crew is supposed to join you, with the promise of riches, and because they respect you and are scared of you. No, Bonnet hires these guys, and they go out, and he is probably the world's worst pirate. He's very well educated. Again, he's the outlier here. Very well educated, and he runs into Blackbeard at some point. And there are two schools of thought on this. One, Blackbeard became his mentor. That's one school of thought. The other school of thought is that Blackbeard realized this guy was an idiot, and he took advantage of him. He took his ship, he took his crew, and added it to his fleet, and he basically placed Bonnet under arrest in his quarters. He moved him to the QAR with his books and kept him under arrest. And eventually, when Blackbeard's fleet broke up, Bonnet went his own way, and he would wind up getting captured right off of Southport, down in the outside of Wilmington, out the mouth of the Cape Fear River. Even though he was not the most successful pirate, again, I would argue probably the world's worst pirate out of all the famous ones, his name was known, and he was hunted down. The governor of South Carolina sent out a fleet that was looking for him, specifically for Bonnet, to find him. He was captured, and he was hanged in Charleston, I believe, at the end of 1718, if I'm remembering correctly. But again, Bonnet he's not your typical pirate. These guys, they're not well educated. They're not Army officers. Some of them used to be in the Royal Navy. A lot of these guys actually got their start early in the 1700s, when there was usually some combination of England, France, and Spain was always at war with one another. In the case of the Golden Age of Piracy, we're looking at the War of the Spanish Succession. I can't talk this morning, which occurs in the first 10, 12 years of the 18th century here. A lot of these guys were operating as privateers for the British government. And what a privateer is, it's a government-sponsored pirate. You're going out, the government gives you what's called a letter of marque, which authorizes you to act on behalf of, in this case, the crown, to go out and engage shipping, be it military or merchant shipping of enemy nations. So for these guys, that meant free reign to go out and attack Spanish ships. Now, if you know your early Western history, Spain had made a small fortune plundering Central and South America. And in the years before the Golden Age of Piracy, they would have these treasure fleets that were coming up out of Central and South America. They'd come up along the coastline there and then head across the Atlantic towards Spain. Well, the British were they were having a field day going out and attacking these treasure fleets. And that, I think, is where the idea of the pirate treasure really comes from, is these old Spanish treasure fleets. But by the time of the Golden Age of Piracy, the last treasure fleet, I think, happened in like 1715 or something. It was sunk by a hurricane off the coast of Florida. So some of these guys, after the war is over, some of them decide to go straight. Others decide, oh, the war's over. Oh, we didn't know that. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And then others decide, oh, war's over. That's nice. There's still Spanish ships out there, French ships, English ships out there that we can go attack and steal from. So a lot of these guys, they just continue the same life after the war is over. Some out of ignorance, some willingly. And one of the biggest names to do that is a guy by the name of Benjamin Hornigold. And it's thought that Blackbeard learned from him. Blackbeard probably was a privateer during the war. And then somehow or another, he comes under Hornigold's wing afterwards, and he really learns how to become a pirate from Hornigold. And they would eventually separate and go their own ways. But as the British decided that they really needed, they recognized that piracy was a big problem. It wasn't something that they could ignore. They decided to clamp down on this. The main way that they did this was by offering pardons to any pirate who was willing to stop being a pirate. And Hornigold was the biggest profile name that actually did that. He had made enough money for himself. He was comfortable financially. So he accepts a pardon. And then he becomes an agent of the crown. They hire him as a pirate hunter. And he goes out to chase down a lot of his former colleagues, his former pirate comrades. And down in the Bahamas, Nassau, it's a vacation hotspot today. It was not like that back in the first part of the 18th century. It was a place that your average folks didn't want to go. Nassau was, in essence, run by pirates until the British governor, a guy by the name of Woodes Rogers, clamps down on this, and he delivers that pardon, and Hornigold takes him up on it. When a lot of the pirates down there in Nassau saw what Hornigold, they saw him take the pardon, they followed suit. And that's really the beginning of the end of the golden age of piracy with that blanket pardon. And Hornigold, and there were a few others that became pirate hunters, but Hornigold was really the biggest name to do so, going out and trying to shut this down. And once the British government decided to clamp down on this, that was really the beginning of the end, because initially the entire Caribbean had been overrun with pirates. Before they were in Nassau, they were in Jamaica, a place called Port Royal, which is right outside of Kingston. And it was the largest city in the Caribbean. I think it was larger than Boston at the time, which, granted, this is the 1680s, 1690s we're talking about here. So Boston wasn't that big, but just to put it in perspective, Port Royal is about the size of Boston. It was known as the Sodom and Gomorrah of the Western Hemisphere because it was run by pirates. And this is where the British start to clamp down. They decide to put an end to this. A new governor arrives in Jamaica and starts to clamp down on piracy. And then an earthquake in 1692, I think, all but wipes Port Royal off the map. So they're looking for a new base. So they move over to Nassau, and that becomes their next base for the next 15, 20 years or so. And that's where a lot of these guys would be based out of. They would sail past the Carolinas, of course, but there's no major port city in North Carolina. North Carolina was good for a place to hide, more so than it was for a place to raid. You could get shipping that's coming in and out of Charlestown, modern day Charleston, South Carolina. You could get stuff that's sailing along the coast up to New England or Nova Scotia. You could get stuff coming out of the Caribbean, headed up along the coast before it headed across the Atlantic. So there were ships that were captured and burned and whatnot off the coast of North Carolina, but there's not a lot that really happens in North Carolina waters because they come here really to hide and to refit. Bonnet, of course, was in the Cape Fear River when he was captured, but the sounds and the various waterways there along eastern North Carolina provided great spots for pirates to hide when they needed to come in and repair their ships. Wooden ships, here again, they're built for speed. So you have to keep these things properly maintained. And that meant coming in and doing what was called careening them. You couldn't, go over to Liverpool or somewhere and, ask to use a dry dock to repair your ship. No, you would have to find a secluded spot, either a little island in the Caribbean or a secluded creek or river somewhere along the coastline where you thought you could be left alone for usually a period of a couple of weeks to repair your ship. And what they would do, they would come in, run it aground, in some cases, pull it up on the beach physically, pulling the ship up there with ropes, and they'd clean the barnacles and anything else that had attached itself to the hull. They'd recaulk the hull because, again, these are wooden ships. We're not talking about modern, the steel navy. We're talking about wooden sailing ships here. So they're susceptible to, all kinds of worms and stuff can get in there and eat out the planks. The barnacles and other little marine critters would attach themselves and create drag, which would slow your ship down. If it wasn't properly caulked, you could have a leak, which obviously left untended is going to sink your ship, but it's also going to cause drag and slow you down. So when you found a good spot, which Ocracoke was a good one, to come in there and careen your ship, and hope that the Navy or whoever else would leave you alone long enough. The various sounds, like I say, of North Carolina were a great spot for that. That's where Blackbeard is when he's captured or when he's discovered in November of 1718. He's there at Ocracoke. Charles Vane, another one of the more fierce and more widely recognized names from the golden age of piracy. He'd been hanging out with Blackbeard there at Ocracoke shortly before that. So again, not a lot of piracy takes place in North Carolina per se, but off North Carolina. There is pirate activity here, but not what we think of. Not the boarding of ships really taking place. In Currituck Sound or something like that. That's further out to sea. That's kind of Pirate 101. I could keep on going with other things here for quite a while, but I figure the best thing is probably just to open it up for questions here at this point. And again, take it easy on me as best you can. I'm more of a pirate fan than I am the pirate expert here. So I'd be glad to field some questions if anybody has any. What we got here? Let's see. First one I can see. What happened to Blackbeard? Well, the short version of what happens to Blackbeard, he accepts a pardon and he decides to settle down in Bath. And he does that for a couple of months. And there's some debate over how much in league he was with the governor and a couple of other colonial officials at that time. There's still a lot of debate about that. So I don't want to conjecture on that. But after a few months of living clean, if you will, he decides that's not for him. And he gathers up some of his old crew who were still nearby, and they managed to secure a ship. And if I've got my timeline correctly, they actually find a French ship off the coast out here, and they do the pirate thing to it. You know, they go out there, capture the ship, take its crew, but they report it back as being, oh, we found this abandoned ship, so we claimed everything that was on it for ourselves, which, you know, no, they didn't. They went out there, you know, they captured it, they set the captain and crew adrift, and, you know, this was an act of piracy. But they claimed this ship. And eventually the governors of Virginia and South Carolina are fed up with Blackbeard doing whatever he wants out here off the coast of Virginia and the Carolinas. And the governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, he commissions a force, two-pronged force, actually, a naval force and a land force, to come down and deal with Blackbeard. So he sends a force overland headed towards Bath, and he also sends two ships down from what is now Hampton, Virginia. And of course, the two ships find him first at Ocracoke. And on November 21st, 1718, they would engage Blackbeard in battle there off of Ocracoke, and he would be killed in the process there. The Virginian force was under the command of a fellow by the name of Robert Maynard. And here again, there's conflicting accounts. Who do you want to believe? Did Maynard himself kill Blackbeard, or was it one of his men who killed Blackbeard? But in any case, the end result, Blackbeard was killed. His head was severed. It was taken back to Virginia, mounted on a point right at the mouth of the Hampton River, just a little ways downstream from the Virginia Air and Space Museum, if you're familiar with that area, as a deterrent to other pirates. You know, look, we captured, you know, the biggest one of your names, and there's his head to prove it. And if y'all continue to act as pirates, this is the same fate that you can expect. Ooh, so many questions to choose from here. What are the, this is a good one. What are the origins of pirates? What inspired pirates to become pirates? That's an excellent question. In many cases, these guys, a lot of them are already sailors. Again, they're not well educated, you know, so we're not talking about the upper class of society here, again, with the exception of Stede Bonnet. But most of these guys, the crews in particular, they're poorly educated. A lot of them are watermen, and some of them were thieves to begin with, and they're trying to get away. You know, they're trying to escape the law, so they get on the first ship they can find that sails out of England. And in some cases, that would turn into a pirate ship. In other cases, they would be captured or have an encounter with a pirate somewhere, and they would decide to join them. Sometimes even when a pirate vessel captured another, sometimes they would impress members of the crew from the captured ship to join their crew. Other times, people from crew members from, or even passengers sometimes from the captured ship would decide, hey, this pirate thing looks fun. I think I want to try my hand at this, and they would join. So they would pick up recruits, willingly or not, from a lot of the ships that they would capture. A lot of these guys, like I say, they were trying to escape something, whether they had family problems, legal problems. Most of these guys are trying to get away from something. Some of them, again, are sailors. Some of them had been, legitimate privateers. during earlier conflicts, and they didn't want to try their hand at anything else. So they would just stay as pirates. And that kind of leads me in to another point that I wanted to make. Alluded to it when I started about pirate treasure. There really is no pirate treasure. After these Spanish treasure fleets, are no more, what we think of as pirate treasure, it's not treasure. Most of the ships that they're capturing, rice, sugar, tobacco, lumber, pine tar, naval stores, and in a lot of cases, slave ships. A lot of times your pirate treasure are enslaved Africans. That's what the Queen Anne's Revenge was before Blackbeard encountered it. It was a French slave ship known as La Concorde. It made, I believe, 3 voyages over from Africa to North America with enslaved crews on, or with enslaved cargo on board. And so when you think of the chest of gold or jewels or whatever, that's really not the case. There are exceptions to that, of course. Sam Bellamy's Widow, some of you may have seen the traveling exhibit, I guess it was about, 8, 10, 12 years ago. That was, I think National Geographic put it together. It toured the country. That one actually did have, real treasure on there. But here again, that's the exception, not the rule. What we think of pirate treasure and what pirate treasure actually was, 2 completely different things. Pirates only became romanticized well after they had ceased to be a threat, and most people who encountered them today would be shocked by their benign image today. Yeah, that's a pretty good statement. I'm not so sure that the romanticism began after they were still a threat, because Charles Johnson's book, the General History of Pirates, that's published in the 1720s. He couldn't write about how some of these guys met their end because they were still active and still sailing. So it really begins, while they're still out there. Why the public is fascinated with pirates, I don't have a good answer for that. Why are, a lot of folks fascinated, when we look back at the 20s and 30s, the organized crime, the early mafia, in Chicago, Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, that type of stuff. Different eras, one operates on land, one operates on water, but I think it's really the same thing. There's this fascination, with this dark, seedy underbelly. Is it living vicariously through these other people? I don't know. There's some kind of element of interest in romanticism there. But yeah, I think pirates, the way they're portrayed today is definitely not the way that they were. Jack Sparrow, the comic thing, that's not how they were. And when you think about, the talk like a pirate day, pirates probably did not talk like that. When you think about talk like a pirate day, it's not talk like a pirate day. It's talk like Robert Newton as Long John Silver from the 1950 edition of Treasure Island Day. He's the one that started all that. Earlier versions of Treasure Island and earlier pirate things, that they didn't have that. What we think of as pirate speak today is traced back directly to Robert Newton in that 1950 edition of Treasure Island. Now, he was from somewhere around Bristol, England. I don't remember exactly where, which is where a lot of these guys were originally from. Blackbeard was supposedly from Bristol. So he probably did, he may have hit the nail on the head. Who knows? He gets a lot of grief today for starting this. He knows he actually might be right, but at least in terms of the accent. But the going around and the R thing, I have a feeling that's completely made up. These guys were sailors. They would have spoken like everybody else at that time period that was on board a ship. So what else have we got? I don't have anywhere near enough time to answer all of these. Let's see what we got. Most successful pirates are the ones we don't know about who weren't caught and tried. Yeah, probably, because the ones that we know about, usually we know about them because we're reading accounts of their capture and their execution. So yeah, it's, the best crime is one that nobody knows ever took place. Who's the best criminal? The one that you can't catch. So yeah, I think you're probably right on with that. And a lot of times when you read the reports in newspapers from victims of pirates, they might have had a run-in with some no-name pirate, but that's not, that doesn't generate headlines. The newspapers media was the same back then. They want to embellish, they want to sell newspapers. So we had a run-in with who? Oh no, that couldn't have been him. You had a run-in with Blackbeard. No, you had a run-in with Charles Vane. That you just you misunderstood him when he said who he was. So yeah, a lot of these guys, I'm sure there are a bunch of them that we don't know about. So yeah, that's an excellent point. What happened to the rice, tobacco, etc., on the ships that were captured? Good question. They would take it back to port, sometimes Nassau, sometimes Port Royal, sometimes Charlestown, Boston. These guys, they knew who, they had their own network. They knew who they could sell stuff to. So when they would capture a ship, they would take it back to a port somewhere, and they would either sell or exchange the goods. And a pirate crew, this was part of the reason why these guys actually were pirates. Each man of the crew got a share of whatever the proceeds were. That was how you had to stay captain. You had to keep your men happy, which meant keeping them fed and bringing in prizes, and not just any prize. Bringing in a little fishing vessel, that's not going to be worth any money. You had to bring in something that's worth money. So when you capture something, you take it back to port, you either sell it or trade it. And then a lot of times when the guys got their share of the money, they turned right around and spent it either in a bar or a brothel. So again, that's another reason why we don't have pirate treasure. These guys did not hang on to their money. As soon as they got it, they turned around and spent it on various places. Some of the captains kept it, but your crew members, no, they would spend it as soon as they got it because they knew they were going back out to sea. And if you're going to die at sea or on the gallows, you don't need to take money with you. You live it up while you can. So that's probably the short answer to that. A lot of times, and this really depended on who the pirate was. Some of them were more generous than others. Some of them would just let a ship go. They would take whatever they needed off of there. And there are a couple of things, no matter what the ship was when it was captured, the pirate was always going to take the navigational instruments, the navigational charts, and they were always going to take any medicine that you had on board. A lot of times they would even take a surgeon or a doctor if you had one on board and bring them on board their vessel. But sometimes that would be all that was taken, would just be your maps and your medical kit, and they would let you go. Other times they would exchange ships. If they captured something that was better than the one they were on, they would give the old pirate ship to the captain and crew and passengers of whatever they just captured. Sometimes they would load it up with stuff that they don't want. Like if you had a cargo of stuff that you don't want, you'd give it to somebody. If there was a captain who was particularly helpful in some way, shape, or form, you might give him some of the cargo to help offset the loss. And a lot of times, and this happened, we know with the Queen Anne's Revenge and Blackbeard's capture of that, when they captured slave ships, a lot of times they would give a portion, they would give a certain number of the slaves to another ship as restitution for the rice or the tobacco or whatever they had taken off of their ship. So a lot of times it was sold, other times not so much. What kinds of weapons did they use? Well, when you're talking about hand-to-hand combats, single shot flintlock pistols, a cutlass, which is a naval-style sword, short blade, very curved sword. You couldn't really have a long sword or a straight-edged sword because of the fighting in close quarters. So the blade was normally only about 20, 24 inches or so on a cutlass. And it was curved as well because it was a slashing weapon, not a stabbing weapon. Boarding axes, really anything you could find. When you get into hand-to-hand combat like that, if you're actually going to have to be fighting the enemy crew, you fight with whatever you had. And the pistols back then were single shots. After you fire that first pistol, turn it around, hold it by the barrel, and then you got a short little club, you whack somebody on the head with the butt or the handle of it there. And as far as the longer range stuff, every pirate ship had cannons. But again, most of these guys were not trained gunners. Ammunition was in short supply. So you didn't really want to fire a broadside unless you had to. Normally it would just be one or two warning shots to alert the vessel that you're chasing to stop. And part of the reason why they didn't really want to get in stand-up fights and why you would never do so from a long range. Think about ships. You're in a wooden sailing ship. If you're trying to aim a gun, your boat is not only going up and down on the waves, it's going side to side on the waves. And your guns are going to be sticking out of the port and starboard sides there, out of the two sides of the ship. You might have a bow gun and a stern gun. But when your ship is pitching and rolling in the waves, that's going to make it very hard, not only to hit your target, but your target is also doing the same thing. So here again, you're not going to fire cannons at long range with the intent of actually hitting the enemy ship. You're going to get up close, really close, so you can time the waves. If you're actually going to fire a broadside, you got to get up close to fire that broadside to do as much damage as possible. And also, even though they would aim at the decks, most of the time you want to damage the rigging. You want to hit the sails and the ropes that are up in the mast to slow down or stop that ship. You don't really want to damage the hull or the superstructure. You want to take out the rigging. So you would have, we think of just the solid round cannonball, which yes, they did have that. That's what was effective against the wooden hulls. But they had other types of ammunition to fire against the sails and the rigging. They had something called bar shot, which looks basically like a barbell. Two little cannonballs on the end and a rod in the middle. You would fire that and it would start to spin around like this. The whole idea was you would fire that into the rigging and it would just tear down ropes as it flew through there. Sometimes you just fire nails and anything else you could find, and either rip down the sails, or that also made a very good anti-personnel weapon when you're trying to sweep the decks clear. If you're actually going to board the ship, you want to take out as many of your enemy that are on deck as possible. So that was part of their tactics. If you're getting ready to board, you keep the minimum number of your troops exposed as you can. You keep everybody else below decks because your enemy is going to be doing the same thing. They're trying to take out as many of your people as they can before the two ships come together and one is boarded. So you would keep your people below decks to keep them protected and then spring out at the last minute. And sometimes you wouldn't even fight on deck. If you could set a trap below deck, some of these larger ships that had various compartments in there, you could set a trap below deck and just try and wait out the pirates. You could barricade yourself in the bow or the stern of the ship and just hope that they would either grow tired or you could pick off enough of their men when they did attack you that they would have to leave. So if you want now, bearing in mind, this is a fictionalized series, but if you want to watch a good representation of what life on a pirate ship was actually like, there was a series on Starz a few years ago called Black Sails. Now, it's not something that you want to watch with your kids. This is definitely something you watch after the kids have gone to bed. But it's a prequel. I think there was 4 seasons of it. It's a prequel to Treasure Island. So your main character is Long John Silver, Billy Bones, Captain Flint. But some of the secondary characters are actual real pirate guys. Blackbeard comes in season 3. Charles Vane is one of the major characters. Jack Rackham, Anne Bonny, Benjamin Hornigold, Ned Lowe makes an appearance. So there are real historical players that are in this. And series 1 really gives you a good feel for what life is like on a pirate ship. You see how the crew operates. There's an episode where they have to careen the walrus. So you really get a good feel for what life was like on a ship. And when the action is not taking place at sea, it's in Nassau. So you can see what the pirate republic down there on Nassau was like at the time as well. Again, I cannot say this enough. Don't watch it with your kids. But what else we got here? I'll take one more question. Let's see. Who was the last pirate alive? That's actually, I don't know the answer to that, but that's actually a good segue. The piracy has existed for years. You can go back, hundreds of years. There were pirates in the Mediterranean. We have the golden age of piracy, which is only 20 years, but just about every pirate that we think of operates during the golden age of piracy here in the Caribbean. There were pirates, even after the United States is formed, in the early 1800s. I think it was Thomas Jefferson sent the U.S. Navy over to deal with the Barbary pirates in North Africa. Tripoli and a couple of other countries over there were holding just about every country hostage. Everybody had to pay tribute in order for their ships to sail unmolested through the Mediterranean. And Jefferson finally said enough of this, so he sent in the Navy to wipe them out. But piracy still exists today. There's the Tom Hanks movie. I'm drawing a blank on the name of it, but he, the one where he was the captain of the freighter that was captured over there. There are still pirates that operate out of the African coast. There are still pirates that operate out of the Philippines. So the piracy is still very much an active thing. And one closing thought to go along with that, we have our new exhibit, of course, at the museum about Blackbeard and the Queen Anne's Revenge, which will be up through, I think, the end of April of next year. It's a traveling exhibit put together by the North Carolina Maritime Museum. It's in the lobby of the museum, so it's right there on the first floor. I apologize, I could not get to everybody's questions. If you have any more, feel free to email me, and I'll try and get you an answer if I can. And in the meantime, I hope that you will come down and see our Blackbeard exhibit. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in today.